Welcome to the 2021 Frank Deford Lecture in Sports Journalism. My name is Mike Butterworth. I'm the director of the Center for Sports Communication and Media, part of the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event. The Deford Lecture, part of the McGarr Sympposium on Sports and Society, is one of the signature programs for our center, and we are really excited that this year's guest is ESPN's Mina Kimes. Today's event is streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, and you can also follow along on Twitter with the hashtag DefordLecture21. That's DefordLecture21. We encourage you to share your reactions and post your questions there. And for those of you who are here in the Zoom webinar, you can leave your questions in the Q&A feature. Our program begins today with an extended conversation, but we'll then have plenty of time to take questions from our audience. We'll say hello to Mina in just a moment, but first, let me share a few words about the man for whom this lecture is named. Frank Deford is among the most celebrated sports writers in American history. Born in Baltimore in 1938, Deford graduated from Princeton University before beginning his career with Sports Illustrated in 1962. He went on to write 15 books, including 2 that were made into movies, Everybody's All-American and Alex, The Life of a Child, the latter of which was a memoir of his daughter, who died at the age of 8 from cystic fibrosis. Deford became a vocal advocate for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, where he served as national chairman for 16 years. And beyond the pages of Sports Illustrated, he was a weekly contributor on NPR's Morning Edition and regularly appeared on HBO's Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel. Deford was recognized with countless awards and honors, including being named 6 times as U.S. Sports Writer of the Year, receiving several honorary degrees, and being elected to the National Association of Sportscasters and the Sports Writers Hall of Fame. He and Red Smith were the only writers to be included multiple times in David Halberstam's edited collection, The Best American Sports Writing of the Century. And those stories, The Rabbit Hunter, about Indiana University basketball coach Bobby Knight, and The Boxer and the Blonde, about boxer Billy Conn, are still celebrated today as exemplars of sports journalism. The Sporting News once called Deford the most influential sports voice among members of the print media, and GQ declared him to be the world's greatest sports writer. This brief summary only begins to describe Frank Deford's accomplishments, but it does help us put in context his influence and legacy. At the Center for Sports Communication and Media, we are proud to sponsor this event in his name. And among our tasks is to honor and promote the highest standards of sports journalism and to consider sports journalism's history as well as its present and future. And it's to that purpose we now turn. Our guest today is one of the most versatile and recognizable personalities in sports media. Mina Kimes is an NFL analyst and senior writer for ESPN, where she appears regularly on programs such as Around the Horn and hosts the podcast, The Mina Kimes Show, featuring Lenny. She joined the ESPN team in 2014 as a contributor to ESPN The Magazine and has since become a definitive figure in the turn to multi-platform journalism. Her work includes notable features of athletes such as Von Miller, Aaron Rodgers, and Myles Garrett, as well as her first ESPN cover story about DeAndre Hopkins and his mother. Prior to making the move to sports writing, Kimes earned acclaim as a business and investigative journalist, for which she received several honors. In 2019, she earned a National Headliner Award, and she has twice been nominated for the Dan Jenkins Medal for Excellence in Sports Writing, an annual distinction awarded by the Center for Sports Communication and Media right here at UT Austin. Her considerable writing talents have translated to various forms of electronic sports media. She is a shrewd football analyst, an insightful and funny commentator, and a savvy user of social media. Kimes grew up in Nebraska and Arizona, and she holds a degree in English from Yale University, and she is an unapologetic fan of Seattle sports. We are delighted that she is our guest for the 2021 Frank Deford Lecture in Sports Journalism. Mina, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction. Some of the stuff you mentioned, it feels like a really long time ago, but it was nice to hear again. And thank you for calling me funny. I really appreciate that. It means a lot.
That is a good place to start. We appreciate funny, especially when it's connected to good insight and such quality writing. We're delighted to welcome you here. I wish we could welcome you in person. We have a lot to celebrate here in Austin and at UT, but we're really thrilled that you could join us virtually, especially in this world when so much of what we do is through this format. We're going to start with a question that I think reflects
heaven
back.
knows I'm used to staring at myself.
I understand. We're going to start with a question that reflects back on the introduction of Frank Deford. We heard a little bit about his career, a little bit about his influence on sports journalism. You're part of a generation of sports writers that represents a different generation. So I'm curious if Deford and other writers of that era have influenced how you see your work as a sports journalist.
So I was relatively late to sports journalism. As you mentioned, I started as a business writer out of college, worked for Fortune magazine, Bloomberg Business Week. And while I loved sports, watching sports growing up, I didn't really read sports writing, candidly. I didn't watch ESPN. This always blows my colleagues' minds, like when they'll make references to, who used to host, I don't know, back when Max Kellerman was on Around the Horn. I'm like, wow, Max Kellerman was on Around the Horn? Like, I truly did not consume sports media, just sports. So it wasn't until I made that transition, which was sort of a quarter career transition from business journalism to sports writing, that I started even thinking about sports writing and, beyond, again, just consuming box scores and gamers, thinking about it as features, and really being introduced to it for the first time. And I kind of gave myself a crash course and Deford and many of the old Sports Illustrated writers, I asked around who were the best writers who I had to read, whether it was him or Jenkins or John Jeremiah Sullivan, or just so many fabulous writers, especially at Sports Illustrated, and S.L. Price. I consumed all of it very quickly, is the funny thing. And I was delighted, I think, coming from business journalism, to see how experimental it was, the incredible narratives and the way, I guess, just how interesting the prose was, frankly, because I had no idea that sports writing could be like that. But it was something that I didn't come to until I was an adult, and I did it for really career reasons.
I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about the differences between the kind of writing you did investigatively and in the business community as opposed to sports. What kinds of opportunities for storytelling do you find in sports that are different?
Well, I would say first, investigative journalism generally, and this probably involves both sports and business, tends to be a little bit more by the book, a little more straightforward. Got to make sure, you've got all your facts buttoned up and your sources, and not just your sources, but you're including all of the pertinent information. And there's tends to be less room, at least there was in my experience, to flex, for lack of a better word. Whereas when you're writing a profile of an athlete or just telling a narrative, you can experiment with different formats, use the first, second, third, you can do different things, I suppose. So especially coming from Bloomberg, where it was quite rigid, I would say, or there were very definitive rules about sort of how stories were written. Coming to ESPN, the magazine at first, and realizing, hey, I've got 4,000 words and I can kind of do whatever I want with them, was new. The other thing I would say is, with sports writing, I was tasked with doing a lot of profiles of famous athletes who you've named. And I think because you're writing about people and teams and games that most people either know something about already, or in many cases have been written about often before, you have to use the structure of the story and the writing to make it new, if that makes sense. And so it's less about just bringing new information to light and more about telling a story or telling it in an interesting way. And that was a big revelation for me when I came to sports writing.
I imagine, too, that part of that familiarity that the audience has also means that the audience is prepared to respond a little bit differently to the things that you write about, as opposed to maybe if you're doing a feature about the economy.
Yeah, I would say a lot more of my acquaintances are interested in my pieces when I started writing about sports, and family members too, honestly. But also, yeah, it's easier and harder in some ways. It's easier because people already care about Aaron Rodgers, and it's harder because people know a lot about Aaron Rodgers. So you don't have to clear this kind of bar of making graders interested in the story, but you do have to clear a bar of making it new and fresh and presenting something different much of the time.
So let's back up for a moment, because you talked about not watching a lot of sports media, but watching a lot of sports. So tell us a little bit about the role of sports in your life growing up, whether you were playing or watching.
So I was born in Nebraska on Offutt Air Force Base, which is why I was a Nebraska football fan as a kid, which not everyone knows about me. My first favorite football player was Tommy Frazier. And I was also a Washington football fan, University of Washington, because my dad went there. My dad's from Seattle, and thus I inherited all of his sports fandoms aside from Nebraska. So Mariners, Sonics, but especially Seahawks. My dad loved the NFL. So I just grew up watching it because it was on television all the time and asking questions and understanding through the eyes of my dad, which I think is how a lot of people probably come to their sports fandom. But it was something I had as a point of connection with him. It was a shared hobby that we had together. And later on, when I became an adult, it kind of became my own separate hobby. But there was a point in my life where I wasn't watching as much sports when I was in college and maybe in high school to some extent. I was playing sports in high school. I played soccer. But I really got back into football after college. I graduated in 2007, and that's when I got back into the NFL and started spending a lot of time watching again.
So you mentioned the relationship with your dad and his fandom. That obviously has really informed the transition that you made as a journalist, because there was a Tumblr piece that you wrote about your dad's fanship and how that drew you to the Seahawks. Tell us a little bit about how you made the change to ESPN, how they found you, and how that relationship started.
Yeah, so I would say after college, I got back into the NFL, and then I got really into the NFL, which is to say I started spending all my free time watching football, consuming football content, spending time on the internet, leaving comments on internet forums that I hope no one ever finds about the Seahawks. And meeting people, frankly, which I'd like to, I should mention, because I think I'm sure we'll talk about social media, and there's a lot of downsides. But for me, one of the positive things back when I was a business journalist was it was a way that I could meet other football fans, because I didn't really have I live in New York, I didn't have Seahawks fans in my life. So I developed some friendships that I still have today, people who I could share common interests with. And, it was something I was just spending all my time thinking about. And I want to say, I guess it was 2014, when I was a business journalist. I, was working at Bloomberg and writing these really hardcore business type stories. And I was just thinking about football so much that I decided to write about it for myself. And the piece that I wrote was about football, and it was about my dad, because, as I mentioned, I sort of fell out of it in college. And it was a way for me to reconnect with him. It was something that we could talk about. And again, I think that's a relationship that sports has with a lot of people. It's a role that it plays in their lives. It's something that draws them to other people. Certainly, I think we felt that acutely during the pandemic. Sports games are when you meet your friend at their house or bar or whatever, and it's a shared interest, that commonality when you're walking on a street in a foreign country and you see someone wearing the same hat as you, right? It's humanity. So anyways, I wrote about it. And I posted on my own Tumblr, and a friend of mine was an editor at Slate and asked to repost it on Slate. And I said yes. And then someone at ESPN, a couple of editors spotted it there, reached out to me. They said, "We see you're a features writer. You write about business. Have you ever thought about writing about sports?" And I gave the honest answer, which was no. And met them for dinner and thought about it for the first time in my life, and decided to make the jump from Bloomberg to ESPN.
It's a great lesson in being prepared for an opportunity when it presents itself, and doing good work leads to those kinds of opportunities. I'm so glad too that you mentioned the idea of encountering somebody wearing the same hat that you might wear for your favorite team, or the little ways that sports contributes to the way we identify with each other and build communities. I share those ideas with students all the time, so it's great to hear you reinforce that. If we think back to Deford for a moment, he would not have been described as a multi-platform personality or multi-platform journalist. It's just not language that would have been in circulation at that moment. But you really could be defined by this multi-platform idea. You're present as a writer, on television, on the podcast, on social media. Is it important to you to define yourself in any particular platform, or is it a question of defining yourself at a given time depending on which platform you're using?
I would say it's important to me now because of my role at ESPN, which is my title is NFL Analyst. That's meaningful because one, it's a very different job at ESPN from being a senior writer, which is what I was before, where in the past, and especially when I came to the company, I was a writer first, and I did podcasting on the side, and then I started doing Around the Horn and TV shows. But I was a reporter who just happened to know a lot about football and study it. Now I'm someone whose primary job at ESPN is to give my opinions about football. And maybe sometimes I'll do an interview here and there or write something, or I have a podcast, but my job is to analyze the game. It's a title rather, that not only conveys my responsibility to people, but affords me a level of authority that I probably didn't have in the past. It's also a title that a woman hasn't held before at ESPN. So it's meaningful to me for a number of reasons, even though I continue to contribute on various platforms.
I want to come back to what you just said in terms of being the first woman to hold that title, because clearly that's part of the generational shift that we might observe about sports media. Before we do that, are there particular parts of each of those platforms that you value over others? The parts of your voice that you get to express more so on television as opposed to a podcast, or whichever choice it might be?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I don't write as much as I used to, but what I love so much, what I continue to love about features writing in particular, is the structuring of a story. And really, that's actually a commonality, I would say, between the work I do as an analyst too, because what I do now is I structure arguments. I only do it within 45 seconds. And it's about why the Browns defense was upgraded this season or whatnot. It's not a complicated multi-part feature, but the process is pretty similar, which is gathering and synthesizing information and then figuring out how to convey it. It's just on a very different scale. But I really always loved, as a writer, as a features writer, figuring out the order in which information should be conveyed. And I think that's something that I would say is probably not talked about enough when people are learning, when young writers are first learning how to do features, that you hear a lot about doing the reporting and the researching and whatnot. But I found the most challenging part, and I think this is the case for a lot of writers, was figuring out how to tell a story in a way that people not only wanted to begin reading it, but keep reading it. And I spent a lot of time as a writer thinking about that. I used to spend more time outlining my stories than writing them, which some people think is crazy. Like, I have a colleague, Seth Wickersham, who just sits down and writes. And I'm the farthest from that. I have multi-page outlines filled with notes because I love the practice of thinking, okay, how do I end this? How do I end this so that the person wants to then go to the next part? And how do I establish guideposts and these themes and things like that? And I just love that aspect of writing. And I like that part of commentary as well, which is, again, figuring out the order in which information should be conveyed, which is probably the least sexy description of my job that's ever been used. I figure out the order in which information should be conveyed, but it really is what I do for a living.
That's outstanding. That should be your new tag on your Twitter profile.
Exactly.
Are there particular strategies that you use, especially for something like wrapping up a story? You've told this beautiful story, but what's going to be the punctuation mark at the end? Do you find particular strategies help you make that decision?
I read a lot and would make observations of structures and patterns in other stories, the usage of quotes, the usage of anecdote, and then you kind of internalize those lessons. And then when you're sitting in front of all of your reporting as a features writer and thinking about, okay, how do I order this and what do I start with? You draw upon those lessons. What's interesting? What's the kicker that's going to punch you in the face? What is the lead that's going to draw you in? And I, again, beyond the outlining, probably spend the most time obsessing over my leads, kickers, and transitions, because the story is the story, but figuring out how to kind of knot it all together with those moments is what elevates the story and I think makes it a true feature.
And you really emphasized also the common point of emphasis from each of those different formats. It still has to be a narrative that draws people in. There still has to be an argument or a perspective. Jumping on a podcast isn't just talking with your friends, right? There's something substantive that has to be there. When we mentioned at the outset that you are visible across a range of platforms and formats with ESPN, and that clearly has increased your recognizability. Has that changed the way that you approach what you do? Having 500,000 Twitter followers, for example, does that change how you think about the analysis you provide?
Definitely, I would say it does. I am more mindful of, I would suppose, the way in which my words can be perceived by different people, but also reappropriated at times, frankly, or misconstrued. I try to be extremely clear. I think there are certain platforms in which I probably feel a little bit freer, like my podcast, for example, that versus a tweet, which can be quote tweeted and argued with and changed or whatnot. Whereas a podcast, it's an audience that's coming to me. They're willing to sit with me for an hour plus and listen to me and a friend, have a very a structured conversation. And I am mindful of that, but I also try not to think about it too much, because I think if you're too concerned about how your analysis will be perceived rather than the substance of it, it can end up changing, what you actually say. If you're worried about backlash, or conversely, you want to inspire backlash because you want to drive a reaction, that's not, I try not to let either of those things enter into my mind. I just try to say what I believe to be true, entertaining, and interesting and educational.
I think that probably addresses another question I would have for you, because journalists increasingly are expected to be conscious of their brand identity, not simply their identity as a reporter or as an analyst. And it seems that there's a fine line to walk between constructing a persona that is compelling and draws people to your analysis, and then going out of your way to create something that maybe is beyond what you want it to be. How conscious are you of branding as part of being a journalist at this point?
I think I'm conscious. I would say I'm very aware of the fact that part of my job is being myself. It is like my social media is part of my job. The way I talk, my delivery, my performance, who I am, these things that people know about me who watch TV, that's all part of my job. And that's separate from who I am, honestly, candidly, because there are many things. And I think it doesn't matter how many followers you have or what your job is. This is something we're all wrestling with as human beings in 2021, this sort of separation of the public and private. But the public expression of myself is my job. And every time I communicate, and that's not just posting, that's talking, even doing something like this, I'm conscious of the fact that I am doing my job, and someone I work with could see it, somebody I'm speaking to, somebody I could inspire, someone who would get angry with me. All of that is entering into my mind when I'm expressing myself publicly. So I try to be mindful of it. And candidly, I save a lot of my thoughts and opinions for private conversations, which is something that I think people could really be well served to do more and more. Not to be preachy, but it's something that I have to be very deliberate about. It is also something you can't hide from. I sometimes hear older writers saying you should just not be on social, and to that I say, well, that must be nice. to be so established to the point where you can, but most young journalists aren't afforded that sort of bandwidth because, and this is media, writing or broadcasts, because when they're applying for a job, that is the first thing people are going to look at, and it's your chance to express yourself. So I would say being deliberate about everything is probably what I've found to be the best way to approach it all.
It seems to be impossible advice to follow for someone who's an up-and-coming journalist, to say that they should stay away from social media entirely. But it does, social in particular, invites that blurring of the distinction between reporting and commentary, or opinion and reporting. How much does that play into the choices that you make? As an analyst, you're now in a position to mostly lean into opinion, but do you have to be conscious with that distinction too?
Candidly, it was difficult when I was really doing both, because I was going on shows and being asked to give my opinions about football players that I was trying to get interviews with. And I was wrestling with, okay, can I talk about this? Or if I talk about this, do I risk losing this Access interview that I've been working on? And I don't want it to sound like I'm censoring myself. I would never be false, but I would also say, maybe I don't want to give my opinion just yet, while I'm still waiting. Now, I think it's a lot easier for me to do analysis, frankly, that I'm not reporting the way I used to, for that very reason, because it is difficult. I always tried to be honest, and still do, of course, in my analysis, but I think balancing the roles of reporter and analyst, you do run into those obstacles. Fortunately, I was a features writer and didn't write frequently enough to where I was even facing those types of questions, because I had the luxury of doing so few stories. But I think being, like, for example, a beat reporter and analyst would be just about impossible. I can't imagine how people balance. I mean, I know how people balance that when, I have colleagues who do it, but I do think it's very challenging.
What about when you're talking about Seattle sports specifically? You don't hide the fact that you're a fan of the teams that you follow. Does that complicate things for you at any point?
I always say that fandom is very different from homerism, because homerism is saying things that aren't true or being biased in favor of your team. Fandom is just being passionate. Homerism would be if I was to say Seattle is something that they're not, or a call should have gone their way, or a player should sign there. Fandom is saying, oh man, I'm really upset by this decision, and here are the many accurate reasons why. I've actually found, and this extends to my colleagues as well, that analysts who are fans of teams tend to be the most honest about them and have the best opinions, so long as they don't venture into homerism, which is when those opinions are just simply inaccurate. I'm probably more critical of the Seahawks than many of my peers, because I just care too much. My life would be a lot easier if I didn't care at all.
Well, it's obviously one thing if you're working for the organization, you're broadcasting for them, or if everybody knows you're a fan, but you're on the outside looking in. So it seems impossible to completely separate from that, and it would take some of the fun out of the activity, I would think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think most analysts historically have all been fans. They just weren't as vocal about it. But I think something I've learned just in my own experience is that our viewers and listeners really love it, because they want to watch people who are really passionate about sports and really care. Like they really love that shared experience of watching people get into a debate like the kind that they have with their friends and feeling like there's something at stake, rather than just people showing up to do a job and be on television. And, there's a balance, of course, but I think being passionate and transparent about your emotions is something that has really, for me personally, has resonated with our audiences.
Well, that may too reflect some of the changes that we see in sports media, and it invites me to return to something you gestured toward a little bit earlier. There are fans of all kinds when it comes to sports. Every demographic category has an interest in sports to some degree, but the people who've been in control of sports organizations and sports media have historically been white men, and today are still mostly white men. there are places where that's changing. I'm curious to know how much you see your role as challenging some of that, how important that might be for you.
You know, when you turn on ESPN, it looks very different from how it looked even 5 years ago, which I believe is when I joined the company, maybe 6 years. Anyways, in any case, you can turn on NFL Live every day, and most days it's 50% women because it's hosted by women and I'm there. Or you can turn on Highly Questionable today and you see me and Pablo Torre, who's another Asian American analyst at ESPN. And I think it is, we're not there to talk about Asian American issues. Laura and I aren't talking about issues of gender. We're just there to talk about sports 99% of the time. Now, sometimes I think our backgrounds do equip us to like have these conversations, perhaps that involving race and gender, but most of the time we're just there as analysts. And I think that's sort of radical in and of itself, that it happened so quietly in some of these spaces, I would say, that it's become normalized. Frankly, it's normal. Like most of the time, most of the feedback I get now is about the substance of what I'm saying and not my identity. Now that's a change, I think, and it's happened because viewers are just used to me as an NFL analyst and not as anything other than that. So I would say from the front-facing perspective, we've made a ton of progress in sort of changing the way, and I'm speaking just to my company, but the way things look, the kinds of people who are being asked to give opinions about things that are just sports. And behind the scenes, there are steps being taken also towards to make that more reflective of fans and our country, period. But it is still lagging in certain spaces. And that goes way beyond my company. That's everywhere. I think it's remarkable to me. I can't express enough just how different things are now from like 5 years ago. And it feels very quietly radical sometimes that just my presence on TV is different and I don't even have to think about it. But it is a very new phenomenon. And frankly, we still have a really long way to go on that front because I am still the only female analyst at I guess anywhere. And we have a lot of hosts and reporters, but there's still a lack of gender and race diversity in a lot of spaces at our company and elsewhere.
You talk about it being a relatively rapid evolution in the past 5 years. I grew up watching SportsCenter and ESPN in its earliest days when Gail Gardner would have maybe been the only woman who would have been on ESPN over the course of many days that I would watch it. And it strikes me that one of the reasons why men are often really protective of sports media is because they value the camaraderie that it creates. It occurs to me that watching you and Sarah Spain and Maria Taylor and so many talented women at ESPN, Katie Nolan, all working together and feeding off each other, both in social spaces as well as on the air, that there's a kind of camaraderie that you're developing that is also helping to change the way that we think about this. Would that be a fair observation?
Yeah, and I would also say that camaraderie is between men and women, and you know, NFL Live. So I was part of a reboot of that show with Marcus Spears, Dan Orlovsky. It's hosted by Laura Rutledge, Ryan Clark, Keyshawn Johnson, and I've been very blessed to have these male colleagues who are former football players who I had friendships with outside of the show. They really legitimize me as an analyst to viewers by listening, respecting my opinions, feeding off of me. So that's one thing, and it's really important. And when people ask about allyship, I say, just turn on the TV and watch our show. That's what it looks like. But also, we roast each other mercilessly and banter, and like we're real friends. And I think that in of itself is something that I hope our viewers are mostly male. When they turn on the TV, they see too, like, oh, wow, like this is a group of men and women and of all races, and they are just acting like they're at a sports bar talking about football. That's something that happens in sports bars across America every day, but it's not something that was on TV before. And I think that it's pretty neat that people get to see that on, national television through our show.
That sort of speaks to one of the promises that has long been assigned to sports, that it's a universal language, that if you can just get people from different backgrounds and perspectives to share that in common, that they can somehow get past some of those other conflicts. The identity conflicts are connected to larger questions, larger political questions that have become much more publicly discussed in sports media in recent years. Do you think it's even possible, or would it even be desirable to simply stick to sports?
Well, I don't think it's possible because I think sports have always been about politics and culture and things that are happening in society historically. And I think the notion that they haven't been is inaccurate. As far as whether we should or how to approach it, it always it amuses me sometimes when people talk about our network or just speak to me and maybe see a clip and they say, oh, all you do is politics. And I'm like, 99% of what I talk about is like hardcore football. Like, if you want to hear me break down Mac Jones, like literally I've been doing this on ESPN. You just saw like tiny percent of it. But for people who are kind of predisposed to be upset anyways, no percent is sufficiently small. Frankly, I think finding that balance and figuring out, okay, when should we address stories, to me has been a really important part of doing my job over the last few years, but especially over the last year, because you couldn't cover football last summer, for example, football or any sport, basketball, without talking about the players deciding whether to boycott games, the conversations they were having, the pushes that college players were making to push for racial justice and social change. It would have been ignorant, and covering it doesn't mean it's the only thing you cover, far from it, frankly. But our job is, yes, to entertain and to give people some escapism, but it's also to inform and to cover things, to talk about the sport as it's really happening. And so, these are conversations we have all the time about that balance and how to approach it and who's best equipped to approach it. But it's one that I care a lot about because, I want the product we put out to be one that I'm proud of.
You mentioned the conversation about the draft and the prospects for an athlete like Mac Jones, for example. That feeds right into the balancing act, because I think it was just yesterday on Around the Horn where you were commenting on what appears to be the falling draft status of Justin Fields, and made some observations that the criticisms that Fields is being subjected to are the kinds of criticisms that historically have only been leveled against Black quarterbacks. And that presents a sort of intersection that may not seem obvious to a lot of audience members, but careful analysis would suggest is important. How do you make that choice to incorporate that kind of observation when you know for a lot of viewers it won't seem like it's a clear connection?
Well, that's an interesting example because the host of our show, Tony Reale, asked me, said, why is this draft status falling? And I think probably the first thing I said, which is not a great thing to say on sports TV, is, well, it's complicated because it's not just about race and it's not just about his abilities. It's about a lot of things. It's about, and I think I started off by saying some of it is about other quarterbacks rising for reasons that have nothing to do with Justin Fields. And I know this because I watched those quarterbacks. I spent time, I put in the work, and I can speak to the particular teams that are drafting them. I can speak to some legitimate criticisms of his game, but there's also this other element of criticism that's historically has been racial and that has infiltrated the conversation. And so what I want to do is, in 2 minutes, which is very difficult, paint this sort of nuanced picture. And sometimes I succeed and sometimes I fail at doing that, but I'm aware of all of these, or I try to be aware of all of these things when I'm analyzing sports, because it is all part of it. It's reductive to say anything is just about race or just about football or just about one particular player. You have to kind of look at the bigger picture and step back and look at all of it together. At least I feel like I do in my role as an analyst.
Yeah, adding complexity and nuance isn't always the easiest thing, but certainly an important thing. Plus, reality gave you points for your comments, so it must have
Exactly.
been on point. Yeah. So we've talked a bit about the kind of feature writing that you've done in the past, and obviously, if you're shifting to doing more analysis, you're not doing as much of that. But I'm curious to know what kinds of stories or features you would like to be able to do. Are there particular athletes you'd like to interview or features you'd like to write?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. We were just talking about the draft class on highly questionable, and we were talking about Trevor Lawrence and Trey Lance, and how they had both just given interviews. One was a profile in Sports Illustrated, one was a profile on ESPN, where both of them talked about how they like football, but it's not their identity, and they don't feel like they have a chip on their shoulder. And that was remarkable for me to read, because as someone who's profiled football players in the past, that is not how football players talked in the past in this kind of situation. Very rarely, or at least not openly, especially before the draft. And I find that to be remarkable. I feel like I was so inspired by college athletes speaking out last summer, because it takes so much courage when you're not employed, to be honest and about how you feel about things. And I do think, for me as a journalist, I'm very interested in those stories, or this kind of larger sea change in amongst young athletes and this sort of next generation of quarterbacks, because they're really socially conscious, and they seem to have found this sort of balance perhaps that might have been missing at times in the past. And so I was reading that, I was like, wow, I'd really love to profile some of this younger generation of football players. No one in particular. I just thought that was really interesting and special. So yeah, I would say those guys. As far as other players, I'm really fascinated by Kevin Durant. Or I'm here with you guys. Yeah, not to pander, but I just think he's one of the more interesting athletes of our time for a multitude of reasons, in particular how much of himself that he shares with the internet. So that would be someone I'd love to profile.
Is that what drew you to becoming a newly minted Brooklyn Nets fan?
No, I did it as a heel turn, as a kind of a bit. But it's definitely not a popular stance, I'll tell you that.
You talk about the athletes having a little bit of a different perspective, Trevor Lawrence, for example, in this feature. And that does seem to go against what the common expectation is, right? We want people to be obsessed with the sport. They've got to be in the film room all the time. They've got to be right back in the office if they're a coach the next morning after a loss. Does that strike you as us maybe collectively taking sports too seriously?
Well, I definitely think we take sports too seriously. So separate from that, all you have to do to recognize that is to look at any of me or my colleagues' social media mentions, or sees them. But some of that too is, I think, not how people speak in the real world, of course. But I think that there are changing attitudes towards work and identity that have sort of trickled down, or maybe trickled up is the right way to describe it. But I think there's sort of a generational shift in how people perceive themselves and their relationship with their work. Because I also think, like Trevor Lawrence and Trey Lance, they are obsessed with football. They clearly have been working at it, at their craft, since they were young children. But I think, at least based on, I don't want to psychoanalyze them too much, but based on sort of some of the language we hear from them and others, that obsession doesn't bleed into every fiber of their being the way maybe it did in previous generations, I think. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a reminder that athletes are people. They're complicated people with different parts of their lives, and we do have different ways of being able to access that in a way maybe we didn't in previous media generations. You mentioned your colleagues a couple of times. I'm curious if there are, whether it's at ESPN or elsewhere, are there people who you particularly enjoy reading, people on social media that you follow, podcasts that you're a big fan of?
Well, we have so many excellent writers who I'm always excited when I see their byline on a story that's just come out. The Trey Lance story was done by Tim Kuhn, who writes for our magazine. He's just absolutely wonderful. Liz Merrill writes about football, is one of my favorite writers. Folks covering the NBA. I read everything. I listen to and read everything Zach Lowe does. And learn so much about basketball from him. Bill Barnwell, who covers football for us. Like, if you aren't reading Bill Barnwell, you're not understanding football at a higher level. I think he's the best football writer in America. And then beyond that, I'm constantly looking for young or reading younger football writers and listening to them, because I love, learning, coming across new ideas. That's a little bit less about features and more about analysis, but there's a lot of great young writers. I have friends Charles McDonald, Stephen Ruiz, Robert Mays of The Athletic, Ted Wynn, all fantastic analysts. And as far as listening goes, I listen to, I do listen mostly NBA podcasts, because with NFL analysis, I don't really want other people's analysis to trickle into my own too much. So I try not to listen too much. And then I also do talk about the NBA. So it's a way for me to kind of stay abreast of things that are going on in basketball. So yeah, I mentioned I listened to Zach's pod. My friend Kevin O'Connor, The Ringer, I listen to his podcast. I tend to follow a lot of sports through podcasts now, which is, I think, something that a lot of people are doing more than ever. Perhaps the move to digital audio has been one of the most meaningful shifts in our industry over the last few years.
Yeah, that's a great list of recommendations for our audience to check out if they aren't familiar with all of the names and that you just mentioned. You've been with ESPN for really a relatively short period of time in the big picture, 7 years. And you've already kind of conquered every aspect that is there in terms of being a feature writer, being on TV, doing the podcast. What challenges lie ahead for you?
For me, it's less about finding new spaces, which has kind of been my journey so far, and more about getting better at what I'm doing. And some of that is just getting better at talking and being on television. But for me specifically, I've been spending a lot of time over the last year, and continue to spend a lot of time trying to understand football on a deeper level. And I'm very fortunate that I have all these resources. I mentioned Bill Barnwell, but we have some of the greatest people working in analytics in our industry at ESPN. So I'm able to access them and ask them for new ways to look at the game. I have access to former players. One of my closest friends is Dominique Foxworth, who's a former NFL cornerback. The other day, I asked him to teach me some things about coverage that I didn't understand. So I find that rather than, eyeing a different show or whatever, a different time, for me, it's more just trying to improve my understanding of the things that I'm talking about, so that I can speak in a more educated fashion.
That's tremendous advice, I think, for people who are not just entering sports media, but have been doing it for a long time. We're about to transition to some Q&A, but I'm going to ask you one last question. One of the things that we do at the Center for Sports Communication and Media is we're very focused on what opportunities we can open for our students, and they're always interested in advice. Many of them envision careers that might look something like the career that you have. If you could go back 14 years and give yourself advice from when you graduated college, what would you tell yourself?
All right, I'm going to give two answers, because the thing I would tell myself is probably not, I don't know if it's going to be that helpful for people who want to do what I want to do. So I want to give that as a separate answer. But I would tell myself to be more open to accepting opportunities I didn't feel ready for. Growing up, I, through college and after college, didn't people always ask me, why didn't you think you would be a sports writer and analyst? It just never occurred to me as something I'd be capable of doing. And that's sort of an ethos I carried with me for a long time, not wanting to take on a story or even a class when I was in college that I didn't feel like I could ace or was 110% ready for. And only recently in my career have I realized it's okay to say things and kind of figure it out as you go along, or learn, or really trust yourself to figure it out and learn as you go along. As an example, a couple summers ago, I said yes to working on some Rams preseason games and commentary, which was not something I felt equipped for at all, and frankly wasn't equipped for, and frankly really struggled with. But I'm so glad I did it, because it was an incredible lesson, an incredible experience. So I would say, especially, and this I think is something a lot of young women struggle with, saying yes, even when, or trying things, even when I didn't feel like I could excel at them. Now, as far as advice goes, it's a little bit, just to be a little bit less, I guess, new agey. It depends on, I would say being a reporter, being an analyst is very different. But for young reporters, you just got to report. And, whether that's trying to get an internship at your hometown paper or whatever, it's all about reporting and coming up with original ideas. For analysts or aspiring analysts, I would say, focusing on a team and covering that team, doing analysis on that team through social or podcasting or blogging. But I find a lot of analysts and really get their start that way. And sometimes, you're just blogging or whatnot, but if you're covering a team, you can build an audience that way, because there's already sort of entrenched interest in what you have to say. And then you can expand that outwards or use it to, kind of move on to your next platform or draw interest from people separately.
That's excellent advice. I suspect that in some of our questions, we might get a chance to get even more advice from you. So I'll make sure I say thank you for all of your observations and insights so far. We really appreciate it. We're going to turn to some questions from our audience, and I'll remind the audience that's live in Zoom that you can use the Q&A feature. And if you are following us on Twitter, you can use the hashtag Deford Lecture 21, Deford Lecture 21. So our first question is going to come from Zachary, who starts by observing that he really loves the Hopkins cover story, and deservedly so. Great story. Zachary wants to know what your favorite kinds of topics are to cover.
My favorite topics to do analysis on are always football. There's nothing better than when there's a football topic on Around the Horn, because I feel like I know it. And that's something I think is generally true of analysis in general. I've always found when I really know something, I feel better equipped to give opinions on it. Revolutionary, I know. As far as writing, though, I always love narratives, and they're easier to write. They're easier to read. There's nothing better than a story that goes from A to B to C to D, and you want to keep reading to find out what happens. And sometimes I found when I was doing features that part of my job or part of the challenge was finding the narrative in the topic. And you might not always, sometimes this is a great story. The Hopkins story was an example. I knew the story. I knew what it was. It was just my job to tell it. But oftentimes you, the writer, have to find the story. And that moment when you figure out, here's the narrative in this story, or here's how I tell it as a narrative, is really the most magical moment as a features writer, that when you are structuring it.
Terrific. Robert is going to be our next question. Robert asks about your podcast, which he observes is really popular. How do you see your audio work fitting in with your work as a writer and as a broadcast analyst? And as a follow-up, do you take a different approach to audio, and do you have a preference in terms of those media?
So there's a lot of interplay between my podcasting and my TV analysis, because it's the same subject matter, only in the podcast, it's more of a conversation. I can go on weird tangents, but I'm wrestling with the same ideas. And it's frankly, from a time management perspective, extremely useful, because every time I do a podcast, I do it once a week. I have a long document with notes and whatnot. And then I can use those notes on television. I can, let's say I one day was talking about Sam Darnold being traded. Well, we're going to talk about it on TV, and I have all these notes that I've gathered and thoughts, so I can just use it. And I'm conveying the information differently, but it's really nice to have all of that on hand, the statistics, thoughts that I've written down. So those, and I get ideas too, by the way. I get ideas for our TV show from my podcast and vice versa. As a writer, I would say it was pretty different because as a features writer, because it was just focusing on, a particular story or athlete. But sometimes I would write, I'd be part of panels at ESPN, just football panels. And in that case, I would use the same research to give my answers on football questions.
Well, it's great to have that kind of synergy between them. You'd hate to have to duplicate all of those efforts. We've got a fellow Seahawks fan with a shout out for you here who very much appreciates your support for Seattle, and that's Benjamin. Benjamin wants to ask you about the article of letting go, and he's particularly interested in the role of culture and expertise, and specifically Korean culture. So he'd like to hear you talk a little bit about your reporting on that and the way that you see your background informing your work.
So that is a story that is a really good example of what I mentioned earlier, which is kind of finding the narrative. The assignment I received was, hey, it seems like bat flips are a thing in Korea. Can you just write about it? Well, that could go a lot of different ways. Like you could just write, you can see a piece that is just kind of like a documenting of the phenomena or whatnot. But I started doing some reporting, and in America, I was living in New York at the time, and what I found was like nobody really knew why it was a thing in Korea, and I found that curious in and of itself. So I flew to Korea, and in the process of reporting began this unearthing of kind of one thing leading to another, and eventually found the first Korean baseball player to flip his bat. And then I also started coming across all of these explanations as to why it meant something to people in Korea, and also why they were protective of it. And a lot of those explanations were involved Korean culture and were things that I felt I understood from my own experiences growing up, and my understanding of the culture. And then, when it came to time to write the story, I almost wrote it as a sort of mystery, and following my own journey, because again, I'm always trying to think of ways to structure a story to make someone interested in it. And rather than a story that's just like, here's the thing in Korea, it's very popular, a story that's like, I don't know why this is popular, come with me to find out, is much more interesting. That outline was so long. The story ended up being like 6,000 words, but let me tell you, that outline must have been like 20 pages long, at least.
What would be a typical length of an outline for you for a feature story, since you mentioned that?
It really varies. Like sometimes with profiles, it's not as lengthy, I think, but with stories like that are kind of complicated and involve a lot of notes and whatnot, they can run really long. And then my process, the way I would do it is, I would kind of start from 10,000 feet and okay, A, B, C, D, here's what all the sections are about. And then I would start fleshing it out. And then I would start inputting parts from the interviews into my outline until at the end, the outlines were just incredibly unwieldy, but kind of almost a user's guide to writing the story.
I have to tell you, I'm glad that the question came up about the Korean bat flips, because that was one of those windows of some optimism last summer when everything was so uncertain with the virus and we didn't have the sports calendar that we were accustomed to. And to be able to turn on live baseball from Korea in the middle of the summer and learn something about a game that's so familiar in this new way is great. And of course, the controversy over the bat flip in Major League Baseball, it just adds so much more context and texture to thinking about that. So great feature to think about. Richard has a question about a good intersection of popular media here. Were you nervous when David Chang used you as a lifeline on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
So nervous. I was really hoping he wouldn't call me. And I'll tell you this, they give you a time frame to wait for the call, and it had elapsed. So I thought he had been eliminated from the show. But what I didn't know was he had just gone so far in the show that he made it to the very end. And boy, I almost had a panic attack when I saw an unfamiliar number and it was Jimmy Kimmel calling me. Yeah, I was also really nervous that it would be a sports question because I felt I would never live it down if I didn't know a sports question. Fortunately, it was just US history.
That would be a lot of pressure, right, to
Right.
have that expectation. We've got a question that either is addressed to you, Mia, or is from another Mia. So we've got some good synergy with another Mia who wants to come back to the question about navigating the industry that has historically been so male-dominated, but as you say, there are signs of some change. What kind of challenges have you had to overcome, she asks.
I would say first that they were very different as a reporter than as an analyst because they're first of all, there are far more female reporters in sports. And there I found my challenges, and I think this is something common with a lot of female sports writers, were more interpersonal, right? Like, because really you're not giving your opinions, it's not about you, you're a vessel, you're a reporter. So it'd be more navigating a locker room, dealing with sources, occasionally figuring out how to handle whether it was like inappropriate behavior or making people feel comfortable. There are situations where gender comes into play. As a analyst, it's very different because it's not about my colleagues who are wonderful. It's about the audience. It's about, well, I would say it's about, it's not just external because it was at first about being taken seriously as an analyst or even considered as an analyst. But for the most part, it's about, I guess, conveying a sense of confidence and authority and not being rattled by criticism when it's focused on identity. Those are lessons that I've had to learn over time. How do I ignore criticism that's really meaningless? And it's so easy to say to someone, don't take criticism from anyone you wouldn't take advice from, and just ignore it. But it's not easy, right? It's not easy when I open my Instagram or whatever and see mean things. It's every day. I see horrible stuff every day. And so it's easier said than done. And it's something that I've also had to be deliberate about, is not just, I spoke earlier about being deliberate about what I put out into the world and being purposeful and mindful of the fact that who's reading it. I'm also deliberate about what I take in, because if you read too much of it, and this applies to beyond women, but obviously it's uniquely toxic for women. If you allow too much of it to come in, even if intellectually you shouldn't be absorbing it or listening to it, it's unavoidable because we're all human.
It is a very difficult journey to be able to separate yourself from criticism you know that you shouldn't take seriously, but it still hurts. As you say, we're human. So we're going to shift to some of the nuts and bolts of how you learn more about your trade. Caitlin wants to know what advice you have for how to learn the ins and outs of offensive and defensive schemes in the NFL. How do you immerse yourself and become more knowledgeable than you already are?
So beyond just watching and listening very carefully, and sometimes rewatching and that sort of thing, and listening to podcasts and reading or whatever, I found that for me, if I was reading something or listening to something and I didn't understand it, learning to pause and make sure I understood it before moving on. This is something that I think when I was a business journalist, I had to learn, because I covered the stock market and I didn't study economics in college, and it was a similar process. So when I switched to giving my opinions about the NFL rather than just reporting on them, I thought I knew football, but sometimes someone will be like, here's this passing concept, and they'll say something, and rather than just letting it wash over me and moving on to the next thing, I'll either pause and ask, or I'll look it up and read it and watch some videos, and then I'm like, okay, I understand it. It sounds so simple, but I think it's almost like in college when you would read a book, you'd have to kind of make notes to yourself. It's almost like doing that in an audio or video form when you're watching the game, making sure you understand things. I watch a lot of videos too, like just videos from coaches and stuff on the internet. But I would say the starting point that I described, which is making sure not taking in information passively, is the most important thing for all analysts.
Yeah, repetition and attention to detail are certainly part of that. I mentioned at the outset that the Deford Lecture in Sports Journalism is a part of the McGarr Sympposium on Sports and Society, and none other than the man for whom that's named, Cappy McGarr, has pitched in with a question as well. And so Cappy would like to know how important you think statistics are in doing the prep work that you have to do as an analyst.
They're so important, and it's also, I would say, equally important, not just learning how to get statistics and ways to get them yourself, but also how to deploy them, I suppose. I'm sort of seen as the stats person on our show because I'm interested in analytics and things happening in that area of football. But what I love is not only blending statistics with what I see, which is something I do all the time. Like, my process when I'm watching games is taking notes. And then let's say I notice, I'm like, wow, it looks like they got a lot of pressure without blitzing, with just a standard rush. Well, I can look that up immediately with the tools we have, which is just my favorite part of my job, is the access to data I have. So right after the game's over, I can immediately look up, their pressure rates with and without blitzing and whatnot. And there's nothing more than I love than when there's this sort of blend of what I see on tape or what I see during a game and what statistics tell me. And I think figuring out ways to marry those is something that I really try to do on our shows. And I think something that I bring to the table.
I think that's a really nice way of capturing the nuance there, because so often the conversation about statistics or analytics gets reduced to being completely in an old school camp or completely in an analytics camp. And the reality is that there's movement in between. You've got to be fluent in both and put them in context with each other. So Madison has a question for you about your own media consumption. If you didn't consume a lot of sports media when you were younger, perhaps those patterns are a little bit different now. What kind of source and platform do you personally consume the most?
Well, I read a lot of basketball blogs, as I alluded to, but I also read, all the football writers I mentioned, and then beyond that, some places like Football Outsiders. .com, PFF puts out great football content, so I'll read that as well. And then I really try to not only read about sports, because I feel like giving healthy and kind of well-rounded opinions is important for me to also engage with news and culture and things that are happening outside of sports and in society.
Yeah, fair enough. Grant wants to know if there's a particular role model or a mentor who has helped shape your career.
I've had a few. I'm really lucky that way. Earlier in my career, I had editors at Fortune and then Bloomberg who, when I was an investigative reporter, were instrumental in guiding me in very scary stories and topics. And I would not be where I am without them. But more so towards more recently, I suppose, Eric Rideholm, who produces a lot of our shows at ESPN, has not only given me opportunities, but helped me become better at doing television. Dan Lebitard, who I worked with really closely until I left ESPN, really gave me a lot of confidence in being myself on various platforms. So that was really important to me early on, I would say. Those are two guys who jump out, I think, at ESPN as being really instrumental in my career.
Yes, the dearly departed Dan Lebitard show. That was a favorite for many, I know. Samir is wondering if there is a moment from your career that stands out as being especially rewarding or meaningful for you.
Ooh, that's a good one.
And we can stall with another question.
No. I would say, golly, there's so many. I think, there's so many moments in reporting, I think, where this is going to sound strange, but not strange. I think also, given how much I've talked about outlining, it probably won't sound strange. But for me, the biggest moments have not been when in like reporting weird stuff, like when, I don't know, Aaron Rodgers came to my house, that was really weird, or when the story came out and like I broke a big story, but rather the moments when things clicked for me as a writer. When I was writing that backflip story and I suddenly felt like I saw the Matrix and I figured out the order in which everything should go to tell it perfectly. Those are the moments I loved most as a writer. As an analyst, I would say there was a few moments, and so I can't really be specific, but there were a few moments early on when I realized that my colleagues, in particular the former players that I work with, took me seriously and wanted to know my opinions about football, and did so on air. And I no longer felt like I was being treated as a novelty, because candidly, when I first started doing sports television, first I would be invited on mostly just to talk about women's issues in football, and there were stories involving, the Ray Rice scandal when 2014 was a big one. Not as an analyst, I wasn't asked to talk about X's and O's, but also there's still moments, and this goes beyond ESPN, where I would make an appearance on a show and I can't even tell you, on camera, people would be like, wow, it's crazy that you know what nickel defense is. And I would have to just kind of smile and laugh. Like, yeah. And they didn't mean it meanly, but I think now I'm kind of just, there was a point, not now, but a few years ago, maybe, where that stopped happening. And that was kind of a meaningful turning point in my career, realizing that I didn't have to prove myself at every step of the way.
As you think back to that transition to sports journalism, we talked a little bit about how that happened. Sam is asking if you could talk a little bit more about the challenge of going from one vocabulary to another vocabulary and one type of writing to another type of writing. What sorts of choices you made along the way to make that transition successful?
So in some ways it was easy, because I went from being a features writer in business to a features writer in sports, and a lot of the tools are pretty similar in terms of reporting, picking up the phone, calling people, doing interviews, structuring stories. But there were a lot of smaller things that I had to learn on the job, which, again, when I came to ESPN, I was not early. I wasn't just starting out anymore. I came in as a senior writer, but I also was a senior writer who had no idea how to get into a locker room. Like, things you just learn early in your career as a young beat reporter, I just didn't know, because I had spent that time learning how to read 10Ks and do financial journalism. So I had to learn a lot of that on the fly, I would say. And then the other thing is kind of, again, the nature of the writing is different, because when I was a business journalist, you're assuming anyone who's reading it probably doesn't know anything about any of the people in your story. Very different experience when you're writing about, I don't know, my very first cover story at ESPN was about Darrelle Revis. Every single person who read that story knew who Darrelle Revis was before they read the story. So the onus on the writer is different, and thus the way you write the story and approach it is very different, because you're assuming a different readership and sort of level of knowledge going into it.
Yeah, for sure. We talked a little bit earlier about social media, and Taylor would like us to revisit that a little bit. We know it's important. Just how important is social media in sports media today?
It's very important, because it is your living resume. It's the first thing people look up, frankly, other than maybe your Wikipedia, when they are looking to see who you are and what you're about and what your opinions and sensibilities are, the tone. So it is important, but it's also not too important. And I mean that not earlier I said it's, I think, incorrect to tell young or early writers or analysts that they shouldn't be on social. I think that's frankly just not realistic. But I also think you have to be very deliberate. I feel like I've used the word deliberate a lot today, but you have to be very careful about how you use your time, because it's so easy to spend way too much time on social media, way too much time with that sort of engagement. And as a result, the work elsewhere, and that's not just being on television or writing, that's reading, thinking, spending time with your own thoughts, that can really suffer. So, you have to be very purposeful. It's a good synonym for deliberate, I suppose, about the amount of your day that you're allocating to that. Because I know colleagues, I don't mean this, by the way, typecast. I have plenty of colleagues who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s who are spending too much time on social media. And gosh knows I fall into that hole too sometimes. So yeah, you just have to be careful about it.
Yeah, it really can be all-consuming, and especially in moments of crisis or everything that's been happening without
Yeah.
the normal rhythms of life. So Rahul has a two-part question for you. The first is how's Lenny doing? And then secondly, in light of the upcoming NFL draft, which obviously occupies a lot of your time and attention, what does the preparation look like behind the scenes to get ready for that process?
I think Lenny's good. He's in another room sleeping. It is, let's see, it's 2:45. He usually starts agitating for his dinner around 3. So the draft preparation for me is all consuming because during the NFL season, I spend very little time watching college football. I watch like the big games, and of course the playoffs, but I really don't watch enough to speak in an educated way about most of the prospects other than, again, the big schools. So from the end of, really, I would say the beginning of March through the draft, it is just cramming, watching as many games as possible, talking to people who know these players and thinking about the teams and their needs. It's really just a lot of studying. It's funny, like I joked earlier that kind of putting information in order is my job, but really studying is my job. It is like being in school. The only difference is instead of taking a test, I have to just deliver a 45-second soundbite on television and hope I don't get anything wrong. But the process is very similar, especially when it comes to the draft.
Yeah, it's a multi-week, multi-month
Yeah.
adventure, certainly as consumers. So I can only imagine what it's like behind the scenes. Holt wants to know if there are any athletes when you first met them where you were starstruck.
Yes. I have 2. One is my very first day at ESPN. I was lost. I was wandering around the campus, which feels like a college campus. And someone asked me if I needed help, and I turned around and it was Jerome Bettis. And I just remember being so stunned, just because it was my first day. So I hadn't been around athletes yet. Very, very nice. And then the other one, and this should probably come as no surprise, was Marshawn Lynch. And I was in Hawaii working with the Rams, and I was standing next to Maurice Jones-Drew, who knows Marshawn Lynch. So Marshawn Lynch was there. He kind of walks over and starts talking to Maurice Jones-Drew because they're friends. And I was tongue-tied, and I never get tongue-tied around athletes, but I just couldn't say a word because I was so starstruck by him. I love Marshawn Lynch.
So I'm assuming that doesn't happen at this point, or would there be somebody who, if you did get to meet that you haven't met yet, that you think you might struggle?
I can't really think of anyone else. That's the one that really jumps out to me. I've met other heroes of mine, and also I'd say athletes who are more famous than Marshawn Lynch, but he just also exudes such an effortless cool that I think I felt uncomfortable saying something for fear that it wouldn't be cool enough.
There are certain celebrities that just have a kind of persona. I years and years ago had an opportunity to be in the same room with Joe DiMaggio. I had no contact with Joe DiMaggio, I can assure you. And the aura from Joe DiMaggio's table told me everything I needed to know. You just let Joe be Joe, and it's all good.
The Marshawn Lynch of his era, you might say.
Oh, now that's an entertaining prospect. I like the idea of thinking about Joe DiMaggio saying some of the things Marshawn Lynch has said. All right, well, we have one sort of final question, and there are probably 3 or 4 or 5 variations of it from our audience, and that is they're looking for that special piece of advice. Folks who want to break into the industry, and it's not fair to say, hey, what can somebody do to be just like you? Because everybody's path is going to be different. But if you're offering some of that advice for people to break in, what best advice can you give them?
I would say over prepare for every chance you get. Whether it's a 5-minute radio hit or a chance to send a pitch or to write your first story, whatever. My first radio show at ESPN was a fantasy football show, and I would show up with 40 pages of notes and probably use 5% of it. And I probably over prepared to the point where I was like a little bit stilted at the beginning. But earlier I said that I feel the most confident in myself when I'm prepared and I have all the information at hand. And I think that will never fail you. Even a podcast appearance, if you get a chance to appear in a podcast, go in there with 20 pages of notes, because having that information at your fingertips, or even or the process of gathering it, and this is similar for reporting as well, will never let you down. And I say this as Lenny walks right in. It's like he heard you, that it was the last question. Here,
I'll bring him up, absolutely. It would not be a good appearance without Lenny. There he is. Hey, friend.
Hello.
See, Lenny is always prepared with 20 pages of notes, I'm sure.
Of course. He doesn't have any good advice, though.
Now, I suspect that even when you're gathering that kind of preparation, something tells me you've got a pretty good memory for a lot of this data and information that you want to recall.
I do, but I also worry that I now can name every backup left tackle on every NFL team, but I don't remember American history or basic science because of my brain. And I think this is probably something that a lot of people in sports can relate to, because we filled our brains with so much sports information. But yeah, I definitely spend a lot of time just trying to remember things.
Well, we know you're going to get a chance to use a lot of that information, obviously, in the very near future with the NFL draft, but then also with all of the things that you do. Again, it's been a real pleasure to be able to welcome you virtually. We'll hope there's an opportunity sometime in the future to bring you here to campus. Have you visited Austin before?
I have. I love Austin, so I would love to come. I would absolutely love to take you up on that.
Yeah, we would love to be able to do that, and we can't thank you enough for taking the time here. Just a reminder to everyone, the hashtag Deford Lecture 21 is certainly going to stay active. We'll make sure that this program is available to you on our YouTube channel, and you can also hope to look for it on your televisions sometime in the near future as well. The Frank Deford Lecture in Sports Journalism is a part of the McGarr Sympposium on Sports and Society, which is all under the umbrella of the Center for Sports Communication and Media here at the University of Texas at Austin. For everyone here in the center and the Moody College of Communication, I want to issue a sincere thank you to Mina Kimes, and a thank you to everybody who helped us stage the show today, and most importantly to all of you out there who joined us. Mina, thanks again, and best of luck with the